I grabbed the microphone. I stole it from you. Welcome, everybody that is in the gallery and who may be watching on our live stream. And it may be slow, and I don't really know what to do about that. But thank you if you're watching. Sorry. It's amazing to see so many people in this room. It's really fantastic. And also to see Kelda and Kim. They're both phenomenal artists, and I'm excited for this conversation we're going to have. My guess is 45 minutes to an hour-ish of these guys talking, and then there'll be some time for Q&A, so hold on to your questions. If you are watching, you can put questions in the chat. It'll be monitored, and we'll get to those at the end as well. So I'm Judith. I'm the owner of the J. Rinehart Gallery, in which you are sitting. So thank you guys all for coming again. I'm so excited for this show of Kim and Kelda. When I first started working with both of them, I knew this is a thing I wanted to do. So I appreciate that they're agreeing to do this with me. Both exhibitions, Kim and Kelda's show, will be on view in the gallery until October 7th. So we'll have another event on first Thursday in October, so you can come back for a little party, and then it'll close after that. But the work will still be available online and at jrinehartgallery.com, which you can check out, where I think this video will be housed afterwards. I'm a person who loves art and the process of art and how art is made. And there is something about printmaking that I know, well, there's a lot about printmaking I know nothing about. So to have Kim and Kelda being these artists that are not only incredibly technically proficient, they are innovative in the way they use printmaking in their work, from 15th century techniques to kind of more modern day risiographs or things that takes machinery. They're really phenomenal in how they make their work. So I'm always impressed with how people make things and why people make things, and these are a little special to my heart because I have no idea how they're made, even when explained to me. So thank you, Kim, thank you, Kelda, and a special thanks to Claire Cowie, who's another phenomenal artist who agreed to moderate. And thank you guys all for coming. I'm going to hand it over to Claire.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks so much for having us all in this space. And I just want to say really fast that from our point of view, all of these pops of orange and yellow with this piece of Kelda's in the back looks incredible. So if later you'll indulge a photo, I don't know. It looks amazing, thankfully for me. Okay, so I've known Kim and Kelda for a long time, and I have a lot of little personal connections, so it was kind of fun for me to try to think of things that I just selfishly want to know a little bit more about, but also thinking about what might mean something to people. I decided also, I figured there would be a lot of people here that are a little bit kind of techie or printmakey, or like where we just kind of, for me, I have to kind of get some of that out of my system, like how did you make it or whatever. So not to turn it into an hour of that, I decided I would do, and they know this only a little bit, they definitely don't know what I'm going to do here, but like a super speed round to start us off. So I'm going to ask you questions, one word answer off the top of your head, don't think too hard. There are no right answers. This, I think, is actually harder than the real questions with long answers because you can't really qualify it. Okay, kitakata or arches?
Kitakata.
Arches. Okay. PVA or wheat paste?
PVA. Wheat paste.
Can everybody hear them okay? Yeah. Okay.
I said PVA.
PVA and wheat paste. We should have. Dry or dampened?
Dry. Dampened.
You thought they had so much in common. Line or shape?
Line.
They didn't know any of these ahead of time. Black and white or hot pink?
Oh, stop.
Black and white.
Black and white. Okay. Favorite stencil material?
Newsprint.
So good.
Mylar.
Frame or no frame?
Frame.
No print.
Oh, that came from Sheila. I was like, who? I know this is hard. These are questions I actually, when I went to see the show, it was a really perfect day to see it. I think I might have been by myself for a long time. Then there were some other wonderful people in here. I could have been in here for hours. And I was like, these were things where I was like, I didn't know my own answer to what I thought about your work. I still have a few. Teacher or student?
Student.
Yeah, student.
Sketchbook or Pinterest?
Sketchbook.
That one had a right answer. No, I'm just kidding. I'm teasing. Etching or woodcut?
Etching.
Planning or intuition?
Intuition.
Neither?
Neither. And you said intuition? Mm-hmm. Additions or one-of-a-kinds?
One of a kind.
Your kids in the studio, yes or no?
No.
Yes.
Ooh. Snacks in the studio, yes or no?
Yes.
When working, music, podcast, or silence?
Silence.
Ooh. Early bird or night owl?
Both.
Neither. Afternoon.
2 to 4. Okay. Thank you for indulging me on that. That was awesome. Because we could talk about wheat paste for 30 minutes. So I then kind of was thinking about, this show just looks so beautiful, right? Like, and this is fun just thinking about your answers just now, because obviously it's totally different work by two different people, with in some ways like beautiful contrast. Like some of the questions are about that, I think, like things that are really contrasting in your processes, but it also just, it's really gorgeous, and I think that's a testament to Judith as well as both of you and the space. But I was thinking, and this like a little bit of a softball as we lead into, I think maybe it's hard, but is there something in this show made by the other artists that you just, like any piece that stands out, a favorite piece in the show, something that you just personally, maybe just totally subjectively just like, and as a favorite piece, and if so, why?
I can start. You know, I think when I came into seeing the show for the first time, seeing the work up, because I've seen it online and seeing it being developed, I had no idea how much collage work. I mean, I've always known Kelda was such a collage artist, but I also did not know the scope of the collage and what was happening, and also the scale of the collage that was happening. And for someone who really lives within the frame, literally, of work, I was so impressed with how much she has continued to go out of that picture plane with experimentation with collage, not only with traditional paper methods, so looking at woodblock, but then also going into risograph, and then also some other transfer methods. So I appreciate, for me, I really look at the work of shade and understanding the natural versus what was created maybe with risograph or with a transfer method, and I love seeing that those two techniques butted up against each other, and that for me is something that I've never been someone to really link those two together, but to see those in action has been really impressive to me, so I love that.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah. So I was here when the show was being hung, and Kim's work was all along, just sitting on the floor, and Alexandra was hanging it, and I saw Plover straight back there. So for those of you on this side, it's the one closest to the back room, and I I just like started taking pictures. I was just like, oh my gosh, look at that composition. So there's just something like breathing about it. It feels like bellows, or it's that deep, heavy black that's so seductive. I think we were both really drawn to in a lot of these works. But the way it feels like round, but there's not a rounded line in there, I don't think. I think it's all just straight lines and really architectural, but it just feels like heavy, and but it's just balancing on this like one leg. There's something so beautiful about the weight of that piece that I can't stop looking at it. And then of course, are we still on the one answer is allowed?
You can
But
cheat.
like this conversation happening is so beautiful. Brown, sorry. So many.
Yeah, so many. Have you two ever collaborated with each other on a piece or pieces?
No.
So,
But I would,
You should.
now I'm thinking of all of the possibilities,
Yeah.
because not only we are both printmakers, which, it allows for collaboration so easily with printing so many at a time, but it just seems like a natural way to understand each other's work in a different sense, so yeah.
yeah. There's just such nice dialogue. I could immediately imagine something without picturing what it actually would look like, but imagine almost process-wise these kind of the piecework of it all, right? Like would be really, I think, fascinating. So my next question is basically thinking about how each of you, how your work has changed in the last 20 years or 15 or whatever you want to do. But I've known both of your works for enough time now to have seen ways that I think it's changed, and I've said this before, I think, to Kim, but also how when it appears really different, I can see these links now, but only after time. So like early work that was portraiture, basically, right, and kind of figurative, and then thinking about phases with lots of color with wood block, and then kind of moving into this. So with time, I now see. I sort of look at these as portraits in a way, right? Or something. I make up my own things. But I just was curious if either of you can speak a little bit to, now I think most people here are, to some degree, probably came because they are familiar with your work. But if you went back, 15 years and think for a second about what you were doing then, what are the biggest shifts? Like, what's the biggest change?
I think when I started making work in undergrad and in graduate school, there was this heavy emphasis on traditional etching, and that's all that I studied. And I feel like up until maybe even the pandemic, which is when I started creating the sewn pieces, that was the only place my work belonged. And so, yes, Claire's totally right. I did start out working with portraiture, but it has always been portraiture that so one of my favorite pieces that I did in undergrad was I did portraits of myself every day. And I did one portrait, and then I would print it, and then I would take that plate, scrape the whole thing back, and then the next day I would do another portrait of myself, and then print it, and then scrape that all away, and then make another portrait of myself. And so I was continually living with that plate, mostly because I didn't have money to buy more and more plates. But through that, I'm recognizing now that I live for working with one plate and seeing how it can change. And so similarly, I look at the way that I make the same mark in these types of objects and seeing how it can change. So I sort of love to riff on one thing, but do it different ways each time. So I think that does extend back to that work. So that's one common thread that I see, and how it hasn't changed. But I'm deathly afraid of color. The pandemic brings out the worst and the best of all of us when we start playing with color. So that is something that I feel like has changed over the last 10 years as I'm becoming a little bit less timid with color.
Yeah, and for me, my introduction to printmaking was through woodblock, but it wasn't giving I wasn't experimenting with monotype yet or with any sort of transfer methods, but I was like batiking the paper essentially, so working a lot with wax and dye along with the more graphic mark. And I think that was giving me translucency and opacity in a way that I thought was interesting. And so I feel like my quest now with printmaking is always, and with ink, is always about getting the opacity that like wax and fabric dye did so naturally. And so like, how am I gonna get to that like place where you can see deeper into a previous mark? But I also started out with portraiture and figurative work, and then sort of, I think the language of abstraction is something you start to, you have to claim, like you have to live through it and really work with it in order to understand what it means to you. And as a younger artist, I just don't think I knew what it meant to me at all. But then the more I started to use those symbols or use those shapes or that way that movement operates, then I was like, okay, this is an abstraction I can get behind. This is like I can see the narrative, I feel the narrative, I feel like I'm writing the narrative, and then my work just got more and more abstract. But I do like those strong external references, like clearly a plant or clearly a horse, or like, for instance, are always coming back. Like there are some things that I just feel like I need to present them as they're seen in the world.
Yeah.
And not coded,
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about how both of you use elements of recognizable things, obviously, and then in large part abstraction. Do you feel like the abstraction has to be earned, like, that it's rooted in actually coming from something, right? So I guess thinking about what abstraction actually means, not just being a formal thing, but actually being pulled from a source. Is that something you think about, or is that not? Like, how do you think about it when you have these non-representational elements? That wasn't in my plan, so I'm not sure I'm framing it very well.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I love that question so much. I think for me it definitely does, because I'm so narrative driven and I'm always thinking about that. So this sort of idea of pre-language, or like what if there was a dialogue between color, between shape, and like how is that loaded? And I can, for me, the tie to the real world or to like the external reference can be like very tenuous. Like it can just barely be there, and then I'm like, okay, that's the title of the thing, or that's the meaning of the thing. It doesn't have to like be all about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like a thing that happens in both your work when I have brought people to see your shows or talked about your work with students is people find things in them that they think they are, and it seems like and that can be wildly different depending on who the person is looking at it. We all know what that's like, obviously bringing our own stories, but it's like I've heard also both of your work be described when I share it with like younger students, everything from like very dark and sort of sad to like circus, as it were, or what, you know what I mean? Like, and it is really interesting because you're like, oh yeah, where are they coming from when they look at that piece? Are they coming from a place themselves of like resonating with the part that is really dark, or like some people have described parts of yours like ruins, right? Versus saying like, oh, it's this playful way of building something like you would do with, an erector set or whatever. And so, yeah, I think that's also, it's actually a strength in the work that it can move between. And maybe for me, I'm realizing now that I will feel differently about different pieces of yours depending on the mood I'm in. This might kind of relate to that, then I'm skipping around a bit, but how do you feel like the place that you've made the works has affected the work? So I know like, you do talk in your statement a little bit, Kelda, about the different residencies and actually making different pieces in different places. And then I know place has been both where you grew up as well as living here. But what would you say about how much where the work is made, or just what you're referencing in terms of place, maybe too, whatever?
So my work has, maybe 3 different bodies of work: the sculptures, the prints, and then also the sewn pieces. And maybe I'll speak to the sewn pieces first. The sewn pieces were made at the height of the pandemic, when all of us were trying to figure out how to make bread and braid hair. We're trying to figure out how do we reroute ourselves in craft and activity, and are we a legitimate artist, and is that important, and is it essential for us to be around? And I am from the Midwest, where sewing is something that is incredibly important and necessary in order to have a family. And my mom is a quilter, and so she's always been, you should learn how to sew. And so I had a sewing machine, and so these pieces were made, at home in my makeshift studio at the same time my mom was sewing. And so these were definitely a reference of place in the moment during the pandemic. The thread was chosen by my kids because I'm deathly afraid of color. So we would mask up and we would go to Michael's, and my daughter would pick out 10 pinks and my son would pick out 10 blues. Here we are. So those have a special place with those were made in a place not only emotionally but also physiologically. We were all sort of at this panic moment in terms of the etchings. And even the sculptures at the same time. The place that I was in, these were made sort of after the fact, but referencing the sewn pieces. But my life is extremely complicated. I work a full-time job. I'm trying to be a full-time artist. I have twins. I also teach at Pratt Fine Arts Center. So I have all of these things happening at the same time. And so to sit and make these marks quietly, silently, the place that I am in a mental state with these is extremely important to me, because it's almost like exercise. So the place for these and where they were made and how they were made is definitely referential of just understanding making these pieces too. Mm-hmm. Kelda.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about what you just said, and how much of your studio practice do you all feel like is sort of keeping you stable or keeping you sane, or the thing, because anyway, I don't know, there's lots of ways I could word that, I guess, differently, but just how much of it is because you're trying to make a thing, and how much of it is the making of anything, I guess obviously thinking about process versus product, but even more than that, thinking about the world we're in and thinking about your way to remain kind of get stuff out of your system, or I'm putting words from my own front, yeah. But how would you put it?
For me, I respond well to deadlines. Mm-hmm. So a show will get me in the studio, for sure. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's very easy to deprioritize it. Mm-hmm. Just interesting speaking, honestly. Yeah. And the residencies have provided that space. So in the home, I have a difficult time carving that out, but the sort of set time to be in a space where it's something you work for, you apply for, and then it's an expectation in a different way that I really appreciate that, that being the expectation of that certain week, or and we're talking maybe it's just 1 week, but it's for me that allows me to step into that space. Yeah. More so than I'm able to do at home, but that's something that I think will just be a life work, is trying to how am I able to both identify and create in that space when I'm also identifying, as you're saying, in this other space outside the home job and inside the home job, and just all these identities, we can't hold them at once. I can't, and so something's always giving. So getting in the studio for me, it does serve that that need to make and connect with material, but if I'm being really honest, it's because I need to make a thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's maybe part of the beauty. is that it means something because somebody else has decided it means something too, and so then it goes out in the world and there's consequence,
Well, exactly. I mean, I think that's the honor and like the privilege of being able to have a show too, and like a space to show work, is because that reason you get in the studio in the first place is to like communicate. And then when it's up and it's only communicated virtually, it can be it's still very meaningful, but then when people are in this space with the work, you're like, okay, now like that's what I needed.
It's almost like confirmation a little bit, and I think a lot too with how busy our schedules are, the amount of time, an hour I can do things in is now different, and we've talked about this too. I can get so much done in an hour versus when I was out of graduate school and working in the studio 10
hours a day.
and I think a lot of that is just prioritization or understanding what your priorities are outside of the studio. So like I think both of us, and I'm sure all of us, are always multitasking, so it's, you're doing things with your hands at home, but in my brain I'm always thinking about that shape and that form and that line, and so when I get to the studio for that hour, I can carry those things out. And it's not necessarily about finishing something, but it's about sort of getting that out, and like finishing that thought in a more physical way.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. This, I had, for some reason this feels like it could kind of relate to that a little bit, even though it's going to feel a little bit like a tangent too. One of my questions is about thinking about how much both of you are playing with control and like having skills, and at this point, teaching a lot and having studied a lot and practiced a lot. So being in control of, particularly anybody here who's a printmaker knows that that's like the magic in a way, right? It's kind of like you control a ton of stuff and then you give it over a little bit and then you're just like, surprise. So what, if you're like thinking about how much is control and how much is kind of accident, and that magical, knowing I at least see it in both your work that it has both elements, what do you feel like are your favorite aspects of those? If that, I don't know if that's answerable exactly, but your favorite aspects of kind of like precision or being able to care for it, and then the kind of rougher things, or the, obviously thinking in your word, like brayer marks or whatever happens, but, and then, so what are your favorite parts of those? And then also, how do you know when you've gone too far one way or the other? So how do you know when you're like, ugh, that it looks like a mistake and it just looks not good, or this looks like somebody who's gotten way too in the weeds and uptight and it's lost its flavor, right? Like, I don't know if there's I feel like that's hard. It's not necessarily tangible. We've all kind of maybe been in that experience if you make things, but is there any way for yourselves that you experience that play between the two?
I think I spend a lot of time drawing before I make things, drawing and then working digitally with Procreate and things like that. And that's 3/4 of the battle, is understanding composition and understanding like how this relates to the original idea. Because once I get beyond that, I mean, I can put a perfect aquatint on a plate with a perfect etching and print it with Gampi and Shinkolei just like that. I mean, and I think I mentioned that to somebody and they were like, oh my God, that's the most stressful part. And for me, it's like, because I do this so often and I teach it so many times, that's not the difficult part. That's the fun part, So that's sort of the punchline when I get through the joke. So so for me to get through that joke, it's really challenging, because I spend a lot of time trying to understand what that form is to begin with, and a lot of that does come with play. It does come with accidents. It does come with trying to figure out, like, is it this angle, or is it this angle, or is it this angle, or is it this angle, And I think I ruminate on that for days, going back and forth and back and forth. And so I think that, having that accident is really all about that initial stage. Because yes, all of these plates have mistakes on them. I think I dropped 3 of the etching plates, as we all do. I over-etched one of them by like an hour because I was talking or something like that, and luckily it worked out okay. But I love the accidental moment of where I'm struggling with the composition, and at the same time I hate it. And I have to tell myself I'm going to get through that each and every time. Sometimes it takes an hour, and sometimes it takes 3 weeks to really get beyond that struggle. But I love being in that moment, for sure.
Yeah, I resonate with that, and also just the question. I mean, I think about those Mellon lectures by Jennifer Roberts.
I love those.
Listen to them, right? She talks about printmaking as what happens in the dark. Like you can't see it, you can't be under the press with your plate at the same time. So you're, like you said, you're giving it over. You weren't even really there when it was done, right? It was done in this space that you can't possibly access.
Yeah.
And then for me, collage is like what's done in this highly illuminated space. And so thinking of those two things as nice parameters to push up against, and then also creating sort of disasters that you then have to like work yourself back from or excavate or bring back to life. And so yeah, that ground is like the fertile ground. Like that's where for me I feel like all the interest happens. But then I do, talking about the teetering, one side or the other, like sometimes my design brain, because like good design feels good, right? Like you're compelled towards it, you're drawn to it, but I always want there to be like a messiness that's pretty hard to handle or like to really understand. So I try to find that too. If it feels too easy, then I know I went it got a little too slick, So I gotta like rough that up a little bit.
Yeah.
If it happens too fast, you're like, oh,
but some of
something's
these
wrong.
I was challenging myself. I was like that screen print back there, the olive tree one was just like a one action, and then I was like, don't touch.
But it like the one thing could be fast, but it was in the context of the group of work, really, right?
Yeah.
It's funny when you were just talking about like you can't be with the plate in the. I was like, oh whoa! All of a sudden it sounded like parenting. Like you have this kid and you're like, I'm gonna teach them all the things and like and right and wrong and like all the best ways to be, and I can trust them and whatever. And then at some point, obviously, you're just like, okay, like I can't be there with you. And then something comes out the other end, and it's not what you wanted, but also it's like better and way more fun and cooler. And then you're so glad that you couldn't control it all, So I actually. I think that's interesting. And then I also feel like there's something about I've been just reading about different artists that I think are really interesting in history, in particular like certain women artists who talk about living in places where they had no control, and we're obviously very privileged around, we have a lot of control in our lives or whatever, but thinking about like living in certain spaces and times where they really, really, really didn't have any control, and their sketchbook or their studio practice behind a closed door was like literally the only place they could do what they wanted to do, and maybe it was even totally hidden and nobody knew about it. But I think that it's not that extreme for us, but I think, nor does it have to be that gendered at all, but I do think there's something about the kind of autonomy you have in a studio space. It's a discipline that you're designing the rules for, so that agency feels like I see that in your answers to that question, right? Like maybe it's about the agency one way or the other, the choice to let it go, or the choice to control it is interesting. I don't know. So do you remember, either of you, I don't know why this came up too, looking at your show, this actually popped into my head the other day, was like, do you remember the first thing you've made in your life? And I don't know if you were 2 or 4 or 20 or college or whatever, but do you remember the first thing you made where you were like, I just made art, or I just made something good, like something you were proud of. I don't know the right words there either exactly, but
Do you have yours yet?
do you have?
I mean, I'm embarrassed at like how many things I was proud of. And I was
I was kind of hoping it was some like I was 3 and it was a cake.
Totally. Well, what I'm thinking of is the grocery stores used to have the like coloring book.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Contest
Coloring,
that you put on the wall. And I was just, I mean, give me an assignment. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Were you in the lines or out of the lines?
I was in the lines. Yeah, I was fully in the lines. And I was like really coloring them.
Prismacolor, pencil.
I mean, and then I would go to the grocery store with my dad, and and we would just be like, there it is.
Yeah.
So proud. So proud.
I love that. I love that.
So this is, so when I saw this question on there, I thought, finally an opportunity for me to make a claim of the first prize that I won when I was 10 years old. So I'm from the dairy state, Wisconsin, which is, I don't think the dairy state anymore. But we had dairy days in my small town, and there was a challenge to build, and this is and I've been thinking about this for the last year, I kid you not. There was a challenge to build a structure out of milk cartons.
Oh my gosh, you've been, sorry, keep going. I'll come back to the.
And I won.
Nice.
And I've been thinking about that in relationship to, the milk cartons, because there's pink, which is like 1%, there's brown, which is chocolate milk, there's green, that's 2%, and then there's blue, so I've been really thinking about that, and I was like, how in the world are you able to let me bring this up in a casual way? So yes, I would say I was very proud of that. So.
Yeah. Well, it is funny because I really did think, like I said, I came to the show and I sort of got to be in here for a while by myself, and I kept thinking like, wow, there's a kind of, you both have, your demeanor in life as well as in your work, I think is super humble and generous, and like you are teachers and you're willing to share. You're just there's not ego, right? But at the same time, it comes across, it's very confident, you know what I mean? Like and you are too, as people, you can rest easy in being like, I got this, whatever, moment, I'll do this thing, but it's always very generous. So I was thinking like, I wonder when the first time you made a thing and thought like, I'm proud of that, or that's good, or whatever. And because a lot of people, it is either, it happens when you're a kid and then it goes away for a long time, or it doesn't happen until much later, right, or something. So I think that's kind of interesting. What do we do, and that's just, I'll pose this for everyone as a hypothetical. What do we do in our society to get people between the ages of 4 and 25 or 30 to feel that all the stuff they're making has impact and is interesting and good and should be made, and try to make it, right?
But that is interesting, and maybe just to comment is that both of ours were presented as a prompt, right? And now with having the exhibition as a prompt, it brings out the best in us. You know, I mean, I think that's sort of
more competitions,
yes,
more assignments, but maybe actually, now that I'm saying that, we all like an opportunity, or whatever, right? So the other thing I was thinking about is how there's this really interesting contrast, I guess I've kind of talked about already, between the natural world and the constructed world. You've both talked about it in statements before a little bit, but I'm curious how your personal relationship to each of those things, I guess. So like, I'm thinking that there are moments where we see a thing and we know it's a horse, or we know it's a plant, or you've spoken even about wind and water, even though these things are, heavy structures in a way, I'm also thinking about if anybody's familiar with Kim's sculptures that are outdoors made of wood sticks, like found sticks, so literally, but anyway, without saying too much more specifics, do you feel like, what is your relationship to that kind of constructed, built, sort of human-made reference versus the natural world reference? What do those things mean for you? I wrote down the words, this was just the kind of, I was like, is it muse or material or both, or is that even relevant?
I'll maybe start with this one. Okay. But I think, definitely mine are rooted in architecture. And I have no background in architecture other than the milk cartons. So, the mark making that I am more interested in, and I guess not only with the sewn pieces, but also with the etchings, and I guess also with the sculptures too, is how do I mimic things that are not flat? And the flatness really does signify things that are sterile, things that are man-made, things that that you do see on buildings. And so a lot of these textures that are created look as though you could touch them, And so when I think of things that I can touch, I think of animals, I think of threads, I think of, just things out in nature, things that are sharp or things that are soft or things that have ridges. And I think there is sort of a play on, like, here's this texture, but you can't touch it, because it is behind glass and it is on paper. So that to me is something that I'm always looking for beyond the structure itself, is how do I mimic, like maybe it is a reflection of water, but you don't actually see that water. So there is always a play on making sure that it is something that is not flat, but it really does teeter on that. Is it flat? Is it tangible? And especially with the sculptures, now that you can touch them and you can get around them, they're made out of clay or wood, and they are definitely something that is more natural than working on metal, which the etchings come from.
Yeah, I think that for me the nature is the muse for sure. And I'm starting to experiment with it more as the material. We're looking here at Kim's piece and my piece. And embracing that a bit more. I'm thinking of construction always and how I built it, so I think for me that would be more the material.
Yeah, I hadn't even really looked until just a second, but that actually is also a great placement thing, thinking about scale also is really interesting. Obviously the pieces themselves too, like are they small or larger, but really more like how we feel like we are in relation to them, or what they might be in that, depicting kind of or whatever. So that is pretty interesting for me, because now I'm seeing a thing where I almost feel like this is also like I'm zoomed out and I'm looking at these massive things from a distance, and then over here I feel like I'm in like a microcosm or something, and I hadn't even thought of that before until you were just talking. But that's an interesting thing for me to just imagine myself like in there, or like scale is fascinating. This I actually think might feel like a good time to talk about your titles. I also had this feeling when I came. I went home and I hadn't written anything down. Of course, I knew I could look it up, but I was just like, I had all these notes, and for a second, I was like, I couldn't remember whose title was groundwork and whose title was mistaken for measure, and it became a really interesting exercise to put that title on each one and that title on each one, and imagine like, what if this was groundwork? Now what am I thinking about? Because you do talk about like I forgot the word. I do remember now. You used the word like deprived them of their foundation, I think, or something. But I thought of it as like they've been released. So that now I realize is an interesting difference too, like deprived of it or like released from it, from the ground, right? And then the mistaken for measure being this kind of like idea of using a braille mark or using something that you think of as like early parts of the print process, or just incidental parts of the print process. So anyway, not to confuse everybody, obviously Kim's show is mistaken for measure, and Kelda's show is groundwork, especially if you're online. Could you say a little bit about your titles, just whatever you want to do with that?
Mistaken for measure. We talked a little bit about titles too before this talk, and my titles for the title for the exhibition was chosen after the work was made. So I didn't have this in mind as I was working, maybe like most of us, or maybe like none of us. I don't know how that works for everybody. But I'm always thinking in terms of measure and measurement, and that really did come alive with the sewn pieces, and then also with the wood sculpture too, because it's amazing how much I had to measure that. And by measure, I don't mean with numbers. I mean with like a stick. Like, is it the same size as this stick? Is the same size? I mean, my father was an accountant. My mother was a nurse, so they are the brains of the family, and I'm more like, is it this big or is it this big? And I feel like there are ways of measuring yourself as an individual that I'm consumed with on a daily basis, especially as someone who wears many hats in a given hour. To a shortfall, I guess, I do have some thoughts on how some of the shortfalls that I have as an artist, as a mother, as a maker, as someone who sweeps the floor in her house, as someone who pulls the tape off of other people's studios at the university, there are ways that we are always shortfalling. And a lot of that had to do, now that I think about it, a lot of that has to do with the mistakes that I'm finding in my own work, things that are conceived as mistakes, but they're also joys. Mm-hmm. So even though they are a mistake, they do come out as being something that is quite lovely, even though they are measured. So and Mistaken for Measure also is a line of poetry from someone that I read quite closely. So it is one of those things that has always been kind of close to my work.
Who?
William Carlos Williams. So I do read a lot of poetry, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But William Carlos Williams is someone that I've definitely read and listened to quite often. But yeah.
Yeah. Nice. And groundwork.
Yeah, groundwork, I was thinking of in dual terms. So one being the groundwork we lay in order to, it's that labor that we put in order then to share something or to express something. Like in a relationship, there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid in order for it to be the healthy, giving, mutual relationship you want. In an art practice, I feel like it's similar. There's just so much groundwork to be laid for the creativity to happen. There's all these processes. And so as a printmaker, that's certainly a big part of it. In order for something like as exquisite as this to come into the world, there's hours and hours and hours of groundwork to be laid before this can happen. And so I wanted to call attention to some of that really fundamental, basic aspects of printmaking. So like the piece on the back wall that drops to the ground is called drawdown, which is a term in printmaking when you are like testing a color. You have your palette knife and your ink and you just draw it down in order to see how that will react to paper. And I had my friend Angela Lopez, and she saw a photo of that, and she was like, "Is that a big brayer mark? Like it was just out of scale." She couldn't really, I was like, "It is." I didn't even think about that. So I love errant brayer marks, which I'm not trying to get too jargony, but it's the roller that you're spreading the ink out on, and that edge is usually something we try to hide or have blend in or sort of dissipate or evaporate, but I really think it's such a beautiful mark in and of itself. So I wanted to bring all of that sort of mistake, which again, maybe we should, to the forefront as this is the groundwork, this is what the practice is about. We need it in order to be artists, so let's talk about this, let's talk about that practice in the studio in a way that gives it priority. And then I'm also thinking about the imagery and where I'm drawing inspiration from this work was a lot of it was done in a residency in a very arid place, like some high desert places, and then also this past July in southern Spain. And the ground there was like phenomenal. There would be like a teaspoon of dirt, like in a crevice of a rock, and like an entire olive tree would grow from it. You know, like the ground had no water, and it was so rich, and like there was just, it was so alive. And so I was just really completely enamored and fascinated with all the complexity of like the Earth's surface, really. So I just, that's where the title came from.
That's awesome. Yeah, I see the brayer mark stroke now too, not just when it's an actual brayer mark, but just that gesture. Of sort of it's showing up everywhere. Also, it's like little roads or strata in the earth, and so seeing these things that are plants sort of seeming to pop up out of this space that does look like earth or pathways is really interesting too now. How do you have artists that you I mean, I know you do, of course, but it's like I'm thinking about artists who, and you knew, I told you I'd ask somebody sort of like this, so maybe you have answers too, but where, again, you're two people where I read in art influences a lot, like just for my own, like whether they even are true, right? Like I'll be like, oh, this reminds me of so-and-so's work, or something I've seen that I feel like is a really interesting dialogue, but I'm also interested in the people that you might look to or be inspired by that isn't necessarily so visible. I mean, maybe it is, but to just those of us passing through, or just what's top of mind of who you're looking at or reading about or might have been part of your practice.
Let's see. For me, I look to, definitely traditional printmakers, and Mauricio Lazansky is someone that I've always loved looking at his work. Somebody who's incredibly traditional, rooted in mark making, rooted in stenciling, looking at etching in a way that is more than craft. So he's definitely somebody that I've looked to for the last 15 years. Martin Puryear is somebody that I am incredibly enamored by. His use of line and sculpture to really understand that form is something that I'm always looking to when I'm in trouble, I guess, in my mind in the studio. And then I'm also someone who loves to read and listen to poetry. So Mary Oliver is someone that I have always loved listening to. So I put a lot of her, like I'll listen to it in the car or on the bus. And for her, she does this, when she writes, there's a silence that I'm reminded of, that a lot of her writing is about nature, and which could seemingly be dichotomous to the way that these prints come off as. And so there is something about her writing that does ground me in a way that it reminds me to be silent. It sort of is this metronomic moment that I can calm down and get into that practice of mark making within my work.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can see it like also not as image, like you're saying necessarily, but more as like also a reverence for like a kind of economy of imagery, whatever the imagery is. So it might be nature, it might be, but just kind of believing in the thing it is and letting it, sort of zooming in on it and giving it this elevated status of kind of just by virtue of like paying that much attention to it, right? So just like a deep read of the thing and loving it so much. Yes. And I feel like that's, for me, what I often get from her poetry for sure is just this sense that it's made me just a little happier to be in a space, which you could, do with that too. Like
yes.
Pause.
Yeah, and I think that with the writers that I read and listen to, especially with William Carlos Williams, Mary Oliver, James Baldwin, each word is so important, and I think by being selective about each individual word, it reminds me about the lines that are, each line is so important and it impinges off of the next. So there is something that happens with each word that informs the next word, and it's the same with the line. Each line informs the next line, and so it is almost a narrative in that way, that it reminds me that the work that I make does have some sort of or it wants to be a narrative of some kind.
Yeah, and then like with Martin Purier's work, thinking about like that scale thing we were talking about before, where you're just kind of unsure, or it works when you're far away and you see a thing and it looks little, and then when you're up close and suddenly you can't even see all of it.
Well, you see his drawings, and then you see that relationship of that scale to the actual structure. And it can be really confusing, and it's also just wonderful to see the potential that drawing has to be something large, and which he did do. So yeah.
Kelda, any we may close on this, not to put pressure on you, but not real close, but move to audience questions, I should say. But I'm thinking, for sure, when I think of things when I look at your work too. So, but not to put, as I said, pressure on coming up with names, but anything that's you were looking at.
Well, there are always many voices and specific pieces in the studio with me in mind. And I think for this show in particular, so just to narrow it down, because I have so endless art crushes, some people that were helping me be bold, like with the getting more sculptural. I want to keep changing as an artist. I want to keep like taking leaps that I'm not sure I can achieve. And so at the moment, right? So I have to like set heroes out there for myself, like beacons, shining like, okay, just be bold. Like they're cheering for you. They have no idea who. But so I have been thinking about Belkis Ayon, the Afro-Cuban printmaker, who is known for her like incredible huge collages, and the way she also has a piece where it like drops down and comes forward and like uses this black, and the way she just like goes for the wall is like she's collaging on the wall, which is like okay, that's what I want to be doing. And then I also think about Geta Bertescu, the Romanian artist who does fiber and photography and performance, and her sense of design and chaos, like real clean, like shapes that say everything they need to say, and then also just the wacky, like the playfulness is something that I aspire to. And then your friend Claire, and maybe some of you know her as well, but Paula Wilson, who's a more contemporary artist, and the scale that she goes for, and the way that she's bringing together the colors and the patterns are. So those are like three art heroes leading my practice these days.
They're just on my quick thinking about them all, there is that breaking from the frame, right? But playing with the frame, right? So thinking about in Ayon's work, like arm extending out and like almost that same, like to the floor, or like a reaching moment or something, and then the negative spaces being so important within the frame.
Right.
What's missing is as important as what's in it, which I feel like is true for both of you as well, right? Like the spaces that are left are maybe even more important, like what's not there. And for sure, Paula's work too, in terms of like the playfulness too, of like, I know I can make a perfect thing if I need to make a perfect thing, and I'm controlling everything I want to control, and I'm going to have fun with, and even with the play with the material that way, right? Like maybe I've made a plate that is in complete control, but I'm going to print it on this weird found material, which will make it not print normally or something. Just maybe again, we'll start to see if audience has questions, but I love that gesture to the floor and like literal call to the groundwork of that moment, right? And that idea of like printing that.
And we're done.
And we're done. And like opposite of the microphone? I don't know. Well, what I didn't ask, so I'll throw this kind of out as we move to audience questions, because I think it's another thing to be a whole talk. But it is how the book, like book arts, the pages of a book, you've referred to narrative, you've talked about your plates that you rework and you work, and they're kind of, to me, that's like, when I've seen when you print from that, it does feel like pages. Obviously, I mean, Kelda is an amazing book artist and teaches book arts and has all these moments that are like pages or whatever. So I'm gonna just, instead of asking even a framed question, I'll sort of throw that out there maybe while people are thinking. If you have questions, do you want to use that as a segue? Like, it's not a question I'm even asking, but like anything about the book or books, and then we'll ask if people out there are maybe in the chat. But my non-question books.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Yeah, well, I'm always very interested in the book and in the page, and specifically this tension that you can't be seeing both sides at the same time. And so whether there's a literal like flap that you can open, or if there aren't any flaps, like maybe this one, but there's sort of this tension as if there were, or as if something just was folded over, and so you're sort of seeing the other side. But I think that the most beautiful and interesting and complex part of the book for me is just the fold. And so whether it's an accordion and it's multiple folds stacked, or whether it's perfect, no matter the binding, that's sort of where it's just something I could think about and work with, that conceptual seed for a long time. So yeah, and I want the prints to sort of reach out and give a little hints and start to step toward the book. Yeah. And then when I work in books, I'm really interested just in that one dialogue.
The spread. The signature, or the leaf, or the page, or where it's like a part of a book, actually, almost more than a full story.
It's like a dissection.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, sort of related to books, I'm always curious about things having movement. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a bookmaker, but I also I love turning pages. I love that gesture of opening things, and I think about that with the prints, and like how does the roof, could it bend back this way if you looked? It looked like there's like an axe mark on one of the sides, or could the footing of that building kind of scoop up like this, or does it go like this? So I am interested in that three-dimensional approach too.
Well, and I think about the act of pulling a print is a book, right?
Yeah.
So you're pulling the page from how seductive those reels are on Instagram.
Those moments.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's so true.
It's like always a book to me.
Appeal.
That's a book.
Yeah. For sure. Sheila.
So makes me think, when Claire said book, it makes me think that I realize that looking at your work is like looking at font, or type, blown up and texted with all the little lines, there's that text relationship, and
font, text.
The fonts that I've handled and dealt with in the past have been humorous. There was this humor quality. I mean, I never thought about that till Claire said.
So my father-in-law is Jewish, and so he came and he said, believe it or not, you look like you're writing in Hebrew on most of these. So it is something that I do think about. I was part of the generation where perfect penmanship was expected and learned. Luckily, my daughter is learning cursive, so I'm glad about that. But there is something about being able to continue that same swoop over and over, and by playing with that, it almost is like writing. Although when you are making that plate, you're making it backwards. So it's almost like the reveal doesn't happen until you print that print later on. But yeah.
Those of us that are dyslexic, though, we had to learn to read back.
And interpret. And then also Kim's been working with letterpress, more and playful letterpress, like Lego letterpress and stuff. And so that's an interest. I mean, I think that you're seeing something for sure in that And I'll repeat bits of people's things if we need to for what else are coming up for all of you.
So I'm so in love with the work in the show, and I feel in both of your work, you mentioned it in the questions, the confidence. Like even when I'm ambiguous as to what's happening, I'm so convinced that you know exactly what you're doing, which I love to see. And this question is a little bit more specific for Kim's work, but if it applies to both, please contribute in any way that feels good. When looking at the pieces, there's this like ambiguity, like are they objects, are they landscape, are they, like the scale of it is so ambiguous, like, and I'm so convinced at one point that I have it down, and then I like come back and I'm like, no, it's the other way. And then it's even like, am I below it, am I above it, am I like, how am I entering the space within this piece? So as you make them, are you factoring in like a specific like entry point or like scale, or like how do you approach that as the maker with these pieces?
Nice. Ambiguity about landscape, what is it, how do you approach it, and all the space in between.
I mean, I think a lot of these are drawn first on paper, and then they all go into Procreate, and they're rearranged. And I was so against technology for so long, and I thought, this is actually really cool to be able to cut and paste without a scissors and glue, and you can just do it with your. So, I mean, I'm sold. So it is something that I feel embarrassed to say that there is a lack of confidence because I use Procreate in order to develop a lot of these compositions. But within those, they have gone through hundreds of iterations. Does the roof peak this way, like I mentioned before? Can you go in it? Can you go around it? Can you go through it? But I would also say, more importantly, my kids are involved in a lot of this decision making, and that has been so fun for someone who does approach printmaking, especially etching, with such a with a love of the craft of it, but I allow that play to happen through the eyes of my 8-year-olds. Like, so my son was like, put an elevator here. Okay, I'll put an elevator there. So that has allowed me to free up a little bit of that play, which again, it is, I would say it's not lack of confidence, but it's allowing somebody else to take the reins, and I think it's giving up control, and that's what's been a really hard lesson to learn. But I'm learning that it's really fun that way, because I've learned to be a little bit stingy with these structures. So it's been fun to have my kids kind of play around with that as well. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
That's a nice way. I'm thinking like about your thing too, that there's a magical thing that happens when you can be confident about not being confident, right? Like when you be like, it's fine if I'm totally vulnerable and being, but it is something when you said made me think of that, like getting to a place where you don't second guess the fact that you might be uncomfortable or giving up something.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. I'm looking out in case there's other hands or shout outs. I know. Oh, are we supposed to be mindful of if anyone, is there anything anywhere?
No one's responding.
Okay, great, because I don't want to ignore anybody.
You did such a good job there. That's what
I know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Kelda. Thank you, Kim. As I mentioned, the show is up until October 7th. Please come back, spend some time. Now that you've heard more from the artists about why and how and ideas. Once again, thrilled to have these shows. Wonderful to have all these artists here. Thank you. And thank you guys all for coming. There's still more stacks. We'll pop some bubbles. Enjoy.
All right.